AITA for suing my ex-boyfriend for getting me pregnant and then leaving? When I first met Daniel, things felt effortless. I was in my late 20s. And he was charming, funny, and supportive of my career from the start. Working in marketing meant long hours. But Daniel always seemed to understand, encouraging me to chase my dreams. We'd have late-night talks about the future. And he'd tell me that he admired my ambition. Being with someone who shared my excitement about work and respected my independence was refreshing. We'd been together for nearly 2 years when I got the promotion that changed everything. I had poured myself into that position. And the day my boss called me into his office to tell me I'd been selected, I could barely contain my excitement. The job came with more responsibility, a bigger paycheck, and a chance to lead a team on some high-profile projects. I felt like I was finally getting somewhere, finally living up to the potential I'd always known was there. When I rushed home to tell Daniel, his reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of sharing in my excitement, he looked tense. There was a forced smile on his face. And after a half-hearted congratulations, he muttered something about me leaving him behind. It was a strange comment, especially since I'd always known him to be confident and self-assured. But when I asked him what he meant, he brushed it off, saying he was just joking. Over the next few months, I tried to ignore the little comments he'd make, chalking them up to insecurity or stress. He'd joke that I was married to my job or sigh when I'd have to leave early in the morning for a meeting. At first, I'd just laugh it off, thinking he'd adjust. But it slowly became clear that he resented my success in ways I hadn't anticipated. I noticed him becoming more distant, and our relationship, which had once felt solid, started to show cracks. Then came the day I discovered I was pregnant. We had always been careful, and we'd both agreed that kids were something we'd talk about in the future. But not anytime soon. So when the test showed positive, I was stunned. I went over everything in my head, wondering how this could have happened. And finally, I sat down with Daniel to break the news. His reaction was unexpected, but not in the way I'd hoped. He didn't seem happy or shocked, but strangely smug, almost as if he'd been expecting it. When I questioned him, he admitted something that left me completely speechless. He confessed that he'd been trying to get me pregnant, without my knowledge, to slow me down. He said he felt like I was too focused on my career and that having a baby would bring me back down to reality. I felt betrayed in a way I couldn't put into words. All the little comments, the subtle signs of resentment, the times I'd thought he was just being insecure, they all took on a different meaning. This wasn't just insecurity, this was manipulation, sabotage, and betrayal. He had taken something as personal and life-changing as pregnancy and used it to try to control me. I couldn't believe the man I loved had been so deliberate in derailing my life. I was heartbroken but determined. I had worked too hard to let someone else dictate my future. I knew that, whatever happened next, I had to make decisions for myself and for this new life that was unexpectedly growing inside me. The next few weeks were some of the most challenging of my life. I felt trapped between betrayal and an uncertain future. I was carrying a child I hadn't planned for, with a partner I could no longer trust. But I resolved to put my energy into preparing for motherhood, even if I had to face it alone. When I told Daniel that I needed some time to process everything, he seemed to take it lightly, as though he assumed I'd come around and things would go back to normal. I knew they wouldn't. I tried to explain how deeply his actions had impacted me, but he acted like I was overreacting. I just wanted us to be a family, he'd say, as if his intentions justified what he'd done. Despite everything, I focused on keeping my life together. I threw myself into work, trying to stay as engaged and positive as possible. I wanted to prove to myself, and, in some strange way, to him, that I could handle both. The pregnancy progressed, and though I was nervous, I felt a strange, growing strength. Knowing I'd soon be a mother gave me a sense of responsibility and empowerment. But Daniel's support continued to be a roller coaster. Some days he'd act engaged and supportive, saying he was there for our family. Other days, his resentment crept in, especially if I talked about work. He'd make comments like, "You won't be able to work this much once the baby's here." Or, "Maybe now you'll start focusing on what really matters." At times, he seemed almost pleased that the pregnancy was causing me to slow down. As though my career and ambitions had been the real competition. Then, one night after a work event, I came home to find him packing a bag. He told me he needed space, and that he'd be staying with a friend for a few days to clear his head. It didn't feel right, but I was so exhausted, physically and emotionally, that I didn't have the energy to argue. I told myself it was just a temporary blip, that maybe this space would make him realize how serious I was about making things work. A week passed, and then another. I barely heard from him. By the time our daughter was born, Daniel was nowhere to be found. It was just me in the hospital room, holding my tiny, beautiful baby girl, alone and heartbroken but determined to do right by her. That moment solidified everything for me. I would give her the best life I could. With or without him. For the first month, I waited to see if he'd reach out. If he'd even want to meet his daughter. But there was silence. No calls. No texts. No signs of any responsibility from him. He'd left me to carry the burden of raising her alone while he went on living his life, free of the consequences of his actions. It was as if he'd washed his hands of everything, leaving me and our daughter to pick up the pieces. One night, as I was rocking my baby to sleep, I decided I couldn't just let him walk away from this. He'd not only manipulated me into a pregnancy but abandoned me when I needed support the most. I realized he had to be held accountable, both for his actions and for the child he'd left behind. In the quiet of that night, I resolved to take action. I wasn't looking for revenge. But he couldn't just disappear and shirk all responsibility for his own child. It was clear he didn't care about me anymore. And maybe he'd never fully cared. But this wasn't just about me, it was about our daughter's future and stability. The next day, I reached out to a lawyer. I had no idea what to expect. And just walking into the office felt intimidating. Like stepping into a new world. But the attorney I spoke with was reassuring. She listened to my story with patience and empathy, making me feel, for the first time in a long while, like I wasn't alone in this. She explained the process, outlining what we could pursue for child support. But she also suggested that we could argue for additional damages, given the manipulation he'd employed to trap me into a situation he knew I hadn't consented to. That suggestion hit me hard. I hadn't even thought about anything beyond child support. But when she put it in those terms, about consent, betrayal, and manipulation, it gave me a sense of validation. For the first time, someone else had recognized how deep this wound went. And it wasn't just brushed off as a relationship issue. I knew it wouldn't be easy. The idea of facing him in court was daunting. And I'd have to relive every hurtful detail. But I thought of my daughter. So tiny and innocent. And I knew I owed her the security and fairness this action might bring. Over the next few weeks, I juggled newborn care with meetings with my lawyer and preparing the documentation needed for the case. I felt like I was living two lives, one as a new mom, taking on the sweet challenges of caring for a baby, and the other as a determined plaintiff, fighting for justice and closure. There were late nights after I'd put my daughter to bed, sitting alone in the quiet with a stack of paperwork, facing a reality I'd never wanted or imagined. Then, finally, the court summons was issued. And it all felt real. I had officially taken the first step toward holding him accountable. And there was no going back. When the court summons was delivered, I imagined him reading it, realizing that I wasn't going to let him walk away. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt. I didn't want to drag this out or make it any messier than it already was. But the other part of me felt stronger. As though taking this step had finally given me back some control over my life. In the weeks that followed, things got difficult. Mutual friends who didn't know the full story reached out, saying they'd heard I was taking legal action. Some hinted that I should just let things go and focus on raising my daughter. "You're better off without him," they'd say, with good intentions but no understanding of the depth of betrayal I felt. Others quietly admitted they thought it was right that he should be responsible, especially given how he'd manipulated me. During those weeks, Daniel finally reached out. It wasn't what I'd expected. Though, there was no apology. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. He called to ask if there was any way we could work this out, without going to court. Using a tone so casual it was infuriating. He talked about how lawyers would drag things out, and how it was all so unnecessary. I could feel my blood boiling as he spoke, as if this was just a trivial inconvenience for him. Unnecessary? I repeated, almost laughing. You deliberately tried to trap me into a life you knew I wasn't ready for. You lied, manipulated, and then abandoned me and your daughter. And now it's unnecessary. He sighed, dismissive. Look, this doesn't have to be a big thing. I just don't want this to blow up into something dramatic. Dramatic? I was stunned. This is your child, Daniel. This is real life. And you think you can walk away with no responsibility? There was a long pause. And then he muttered something about how he'd help out in his own way. As if tossing scraps at us would somehow make up for everything. That was when I realized he didn't see this the way I did at all. To him, this was a small inconvenience he wanted to brush aside. I hung up, even more resolved to follow through with the case. The court date came faster than I expected. Walking into the courthouse that morning felt surreal, like an out-of-body experience. The lawyer was by my side, her presence comforting and professional. But inside I was churning with a mix of anger, heartbreak, and determination. I kept thinking of my daughter. This innocent child who deserved so much more than a father who didn't even care to show up for her. When Daniel walked in, he barely looked at me. I saw him take a seat with his lawyer. His face unreadable. It was a small comfort that he looked nervous. Maybe he was finally feeling the gravity of what he'd done. In the courtroom, the facts were laid out clearly. My lawyer described his manipulation, his abandonment, and the financial and emotional toll his actions had taken on me and would inevitably take on our daughter. His lawyer tried to downplay it, emphasizing that we hadn't been married and that relationship misunderstandings didn't warrant any special damages. I had to sit there, listening to the ways they tried to minimize everything he'd done, brushing aside my experience like it was just a minor inconvenience. When I took the stand, I spoke honestly. I described how I'd trusted him, how I believed we were building a life together, and how devastated I'd been to learn that he'd been trying to sabotage my dreams. I talked about the pain of carrying and giving birth to a child he would never even meet. Every word felt raw, but saying it aloud also felt like a release, as though I was letting go of a weight that had been crushing me. The judge listened carefully, and at the end of it, the ruling was in my favor. Daniel was ordered to pay child support and a set amount in damages for emotional and financial distress. He didn't look at me once as the decision was read, and I could tell he was angry. But I didn't care. I had won not just the case, but a sense of validation for everything I'd been through. Leaving the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I knew that money couldn't erase what had happened, but it gave me a small sense of justice. It meant that I could give my daughter the security she deserved. And it was proof that his actions had real consequences. When I got home, I picked up my daughter, holding her close and whispering a promise that I'd always fight for her. In that moment, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and strength. I was determined to move forward, to build a life for the two of us, filled with love, stability, and the knowledge that we could overcome anything together. From that day on, I knew I didn't need anyone who would try to hold me back. My daughter and I would write our own story, a story free from manipulation and betrayal, built on resilience and love. And for the first time in months, I felt like we were going to be okay. As the weeks passed after the court ruling, I found myself adjusting to a new rhythm of life. With the legal battles behind me, my focus shifted entirely to building a stable, happy environment for my daughter and reclaiming the parts of myself I'd almost lost. My daughter was a constant reminder of why I'd fought so hard. Her small, trusting eyes filling me with determination every time I looked at her. The judgment didn't immediately erase the resentment I felt toward Daniel. Sometimes, late at night when my daughter was asleep, I'd catch myself reliving conversations, moments where he'd tried to undermine me, belittling my accomplishments, and I'd feel the sting of his betrayal all over again. But little by little, I found ways to release that bitterness. I'd promised myself that I'd be the kind of parent who provided strength, security, and love, and I knew that meant letting go of the resentment that held me back. My career had taken a temporary step back during all of this. Between the pregnancy, the baby, And the court case. It was impossible to juggle everything at the pace I once had. But with a newfound sense of clarity, I began exploring ways to reintegrate myself into my work. Some days were challenging, but I felt the ambition returning. A drive not only to succeed for myself but to build a future for my daughter. My company had been incredibly supportive, allowing me the flexibility I needed and even helping me find a balance as I navigated motherhood. Friends who had supported me through the trial remained close, offering help whenever I needed it. A few who had suggested I let things go had quietly drifted away. And I didn't chase after them. This entire experience had highlighted the importance of surrounding myself with people who understood me and respected my boundaries. There was also a surprising amount of healing in the mundane. I found myself finding joy in the little things again, cooking meals for us, setting up a cozy nursery for my daughter, and creating small routines that became the foundation of our days. It felt like I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece, and redefining what success, love, and happiness looked like. A year later, I took my daughter to the courthouse to finalize some paperwork regarding Daniel's payments. By then, I felt less like the person who had fought so fiercely against betrayal and more like someone who had stepped forward into a new, hopeful chapter. I held my daughter's hand tightly, feeling a strange gratitude that this ordeal had given me such clarity about what mattered. As I walked out, I looked back one last time. In a strange way, that courthouse had become a symbol of both the hardest moments of my life and the resilience I'd found to overcome them. I walked away knowing that Daniel's actions no longer defined me. This was my story now, a story of strength, self-respect, and a mother's unwavering love. From that moment, I was free to live a life that was fully and unapologetically mine. I'd found my own peace and created a world where my daughter and I could thrive. And for the first time, I was no longer looking back. As the years went by, the life I built with my daughter grew into something beautiful and deeply fulfilling. Watching her take her first steps, hearing her first words, and watching her personality blossom made every challenge I'd faced feel like a distant memory. She was resilient and curious, with a spark in her eye that reminded me of the strength I'd fought to reclaim. Each milestone felt like a testament to our journey, one that was ours alone. Eventually, my career found its rhythm again. I was back to leading projects, working with clients, and even mentoring younger colleagues who looked to me as a source of inspiration. I'd become someone who knew how to prioritize, who wasn't afraid to say no when necessary, and who had a deep appreciation for balance. My work wasn't just about ambition anymore, it was about building a secure foundation for my daughter and showing her, by example, what it meant to live with integrity and self-respect. As she got older, I often found myself thinking about how to explain her father's absence. I didn't want her to carry any resentment or feel like she was missing out. But I wanted her to understand that I'd always protected her and made choices in her best interest. I practiced what I'd say when that day came, imagining the gentlest way to convey a complicated truth. I hoped she'd see that her family, though unconventional, was built on strength and resilience. Over time, the bitterness I'd once felt for Daniel faded into something closer to acceptance. He'd occasionally send minimal child support payments as mandated by the court. Though he never attempted to reconnect, it was clear that he had fully moved on with his life. As if we were merely a brief, forgotten chapter. But by then, it no longer bothered me. I realized he was no longer a character in my story, just a footnote to an experience that had ultimately shaped me into a stronger person. Then, when my daughter was old enough to understand, we had the conversation I'd been preparing for. Sitting on the couch, her small hand in mine, I explained, in simple words, that her father had chosen a different path and wasn't a part of our lives. But that we were better off for it. She looked at me with wide eyes, processing, and then hugged me tightly. "It's okay, Mommy," she whispered. "We have each other." In that moment, I felt an indescribable sense of peace. I had done what was right for both of us, and I had given her a life rooted in love and security. Despite everything, she grew up knowing that our family was a place of warmth and honesty, filled with friends and relatives who cherished her as deeply as I did. Years later, as she prepared to graduate from high school, I watched her with pride. She was confident, intelligent, and compassionate. I saw in her a young woman who had taken the best of what I'd hoped to pass on. Unaffected by the past, she was ready to step into the world on her own terms. Just as I had. Looking back, I knew I'd made the right decision all those years ago. I had protected her, provided for her, and, most importantly, loved her unconditionally. Daniel's actions had nearly derailed my life. But they had also led me to a strength and independence I'd never known before. In the end, I'd found my own peace. And together, my daughter and I had created a life filled with joy, resilience, and unbreakable love.